The Cryptic Note. Chapter 1. The First Discovery. Chief Sarah Hawkins pulled up to the old Willow Creek Bridge, her cruiser's tires crunching on the gravel. The early morning mist hung low over the water, giving the scene an eerie quality. As she stepped out of the vehicle, the chill in the air made her shiver despite her heavy jacket. "What have we got, Johnson?" she called out to her deputy, who was already on the scene. Deputy Mark Johnson turned to face her, his expression grim. "It's not pretty, Chief. Male victim, late 40s or early 50s. Looks like he fell from the bridge, but—" He hesitated. "But what?" Sarah pressed. "There are some inconsistencies. And there's something else you should see." Sarah followed Johnson to where the body lay on the rocky shore beneath the bridge. The victim's limbs were splayed at unnatural angles, and even from a distance, she could see the dark bruising around his neck. "Doesn't look like a simple fall," she muttered. "No, ma'am," Johnson agreed. "And there's this." He handed her an evidence bag containing a small piece of paper. Sarah examined the note through the plastic. The handwriting was neat and precise, almost too perfect. "The sins of the father shall be visited upon the son. 1 of 7. A chill ran down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What the hell does that mean?" Johnson shook his head. "No idea, Chief. But it was clutched in his hand when we found him." Sarah looked back at the body, her mind racing. Something about this felt off beyond just the obvious tragedy of a death. "Let's get the coroner out here. I want a full workup. And Johnson, start canvassing the area. Someone must have seen or heard something." As her team began their work, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Chapter 2. A Town on Edge. News of the death spread quickly through Millbrook, the small town of just over 5,000 residents. By lunchtime, the local diner was buzzing with speculation and gossip. Sarah sat at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She'd been up since the call came in at 5 a.m., and the lack of sleep was starting to catch up with her. "Refill, Chief?" Marge, the owner of the diner, asked. Sarah nodded gratefully. "Thanks, Marge. Any chance you knew our victim?" Marge's face fell. "Poor Tom. Yeah, I knew him. Not well, mind you, but he'd come in for breakfast most Sundays. Kept to himself mostly. You figure out what happened yet?" Sarah sighed. "We're working on it. Did Tom have any family in town?" Marge shook her head. "Not that I know of. Think he had a son somewhere out west, but they weren't close. Tom never talked much about his past." As Sarah was about to ask another question, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Johnson. "Chief, we've got another one." Sarah's heart sank. She quickly paid for her coffee and headed for the door. "Everything okay?" Marge called after her. "I hope so," Sarah replied, but she had a sinking feeling that things were about to get much worse. Chapter 3. The Second Victim. The scene at the old mill on the outskirts of town was chaotic. Sarah had to push her way through a crowd of onlookers to reach the police tape. Johnson was waiting for her, his face pale. "What happened?" Sarah demanded. Johnson led her inside the dilapidated building. Construction crew found her when they came to start demolition work. "It's Ellen Prescott, the high school English teacher." Sarah's stomach lurched as they approached the body. Ellen lay sprawled across a pile of old lumber, her eyes wide and staring. There were no obvious signs of trauma, but the unnatural pallor of her skin told Sarah this was no accident. "And there's this," Johnson said, handing her another evidence bag. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she read the note. "Secrets whispered in the dark will always come to light. 2 of 7. "Damn it," Sarah muttered. "We've got a serial killer on our hands." Johnson nodded grimly. "What do we do, Chief?" Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "We need to connect the dots. What links Tom and Ellen? And what's the significance of these notes?" As they exited the mill, Sarah was met by a wall of questions from the gathered crowd. She raised her hands for silence. "I know you're all concerned," she began. But I need you to remain calm. We're investigating these incidents and will keep you informed. In the meantime, please be vigilant and report anything suspicious." As the crowd dispersed, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of their fear and expectations. She had to solve this case and fast before panic set in. Chapter 4. Digging Deeper. Back at the station, Sarah stared at the evidence board, trying to make sense of the connections. 2 victims, 2 cryptic notes, and a town full of secrets. "Johnson," she called out, "what have we got on the victims' backgrounds?" Her deputy flipped through his notes. Not much in common at first glance. Tom was a loner, worked odd jobs around town. Ellen was well-liked. Been teaching at the high school for over a decade. No obvious connection between them. Sarah frowned. There has to be something we're missing. The notes suggest a shared history or secret. Dig deeper into their pasts. I want to know everything about them from birth to death. As Johnson left to make some calls, Sarah's phone rang. It was Mayor Simmons. "Chief Hawkins," the mayor's voice was tense. "I'm calling an emergency town meeting tonight. I need you there to address the public's concerns." Sarah sighed. "With all due respect, Mayor, I think my time would be better spent investigating Dash." "This isn't a request, Chief," Simmons cut her off. "People are scared. They need reassurance from law enforcement. Be there." The line went dead before Sarah could respond. She slammed the phone down in frustration. Every minute spent placating the public was a minute the killer could use to plan their next move. As she turned back to the evidence board, a detail caught her eye. Both victims had lived in Millbrook their entire lives. In a town this small, that meant their paths must have crossed at some point. But when? And why? Sarah grabbed her jacket. It was time to start asking some uncomfortable questions. Chapter 5. Whispers of the Past. The Millbrook Historical Society was housed in an old Victorian mansion on the edge of town. As Sarah climbed the creaking steps, she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she sought were buried somewhere in the town's past. Martha Jennings, the elderly curator, greeted her at the door. "Chief Hawkins, what a surprise. What brings you here?" Sarah followed Martha into the dusty interior. "I'm looking into the backgrounds of Tom Fletcher and Ellen Prescott. I was hoping you might have some information on their families' histories in Millbrook." Martha's eyes narrowed slightly. "This is about those awful deaths, isn't it? Such a tragedy." Sarah nodded. "Yes, and I'm trying to understand if there's any connection between the victims." Martha hesitated for a moment, then said, "Well, I suppose there's no harm in showing you the records. Follow me." In a back room filled with filing cabinets, Martha pulled out several folders. The Fletchers and the Prescotts were both founding families of Millbrook. In fact, there was quite a scandal involving them back in the 1950s. Sarah leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What kind of scandal?" Martha lowered her voice, as if sharing a secret. "There was a fire at the old church. Several people died, including members of both families. The official report said it was an accident, but there were rumors." "Rumors of what?" Sarah pressed. Martha shook her head. "Oh, it was all so long ago. Talk of arson, of a cover-up. But nothing was ever proven." As Sarah left the Historical Society, her mind was racing. A decades-old tragedy involving both victims' families couldn't be a coincidence. But how did it connect to the present-day murders? Her phone buzzed with a text from Johnson. "Chief, you need to see this. Another body." Sarah's heart sank. The killer was moving faster now, and she was no closer to stopping them. Chapter 6. The Third Strike. The scene at the abandoned church sent chills down Sarah's spine. The old building had stood empty for years, a reminder of the tragedy Martha had mentioned. Now it was a crime scene once again. Johnson met her at the entrance, his face grim. "It's bad, Chief. Really bad." Inside, the body of Father Michael O'Brien lay sprawled across the altar, his priest's collar stained with blood. Sarah approached slowly, taking in the details. Unlike the previous victims, the cause of death here was obvious. A single gunshot wound to the chest. Any sign of a note? Sarah asked, dreading the answer. Johnson handed her an evidence bag. The message inside made her blood run cold. Even the holiest among us cannot outrun their past. 3 of 7. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the implications. Johnson, I need you to look into Father O'Brien's background. Focus on any connections to the Fletcher and Prescott families, especially around the time of the church fire in the 1950s. As they exited the church, Sarah was confronted by a crowd of angry and frightened townspeople. At the forefront was Mayor Simmons, his face red with barely contained rage. Chief Hawkins, he bellowed. 3 deaths in as many days and you have nothing to show for it? The people of Millbrook demand answers. Sarah raised her hands, trying to calm the crowd. I understand your frustration and fear. We are working around the clock to solve these crimes. But I need your help. If anyone has any information about the victims or their families' histories in Millbrook, please come forward. As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the answers they needed were hidden somewhere in the town's collective memory. But would she be able to uncover the truth before the killer struck again? Chapter 7 Echoes from the Past. The emergency town meeting that evening was a powder keg of fear and anger. Sarah stood at the podium, facing a sea of worried faces. I know you're all scared, she began, and you have every right to be. But I promise you we are doing everything in our power to catch this killer. A voice from the back of the room called out. How can we trust you? You've got no leads, no suspects. Sarah took a deep breath. That's not entirely true. We believe these murders are connected to events that happened in Millbrook's past, specifically the church fire of 1953. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sarah noticed several of the older residents exchanging worried glances. If anyone has any information about that incident or the families involved, please come forward. Your help could be crucial in solving this case. As the meeting broke up, an elderly man approached Sarah. His hand shook as he introduced himself as Harold Cooper. Chief, he said in a quavering voice, I was just a boy when the church burned, but I remember that night. There's something you should know. Sarah leaned in close. What is it, Mr. Cooper? Harold's eyes darted around nervously. It wasn't an accident. I saw someone leaving the church just before the fire started. It was Dash. Suddenly, the lights in the town hall went out, plunging the room into darkness. Screams erupted from the crowd. When the emergency lights flickered on a few seconds later, Harold Cooper was gone. Sarah's heart raced as she ordered her deputies to search the building. But she knew with a sinking feeling that they wouldn't find him. The killer had struck again right under their noses. Chapter 8 Race Against Time. The disappearance of Harold Cooper sent shockwaves through Millbrook. Sarah and her team worked around the clock, combing through old records and interviewing anyone who might have information about the church fire. As she pored over decades-old newspaper clippings in her office, Sarah's eyes caught a familiar name, Prescott. Ellen's grandfather had been on the church board at the time of the fire. And next to his name was Tom Fletcher's father, listed as a volunteer firefighter. Johnson, Sarah called out. I need everything we have on the Prescott and Fletcher families from the 1950s. And see if you can find any connection to Father O'Brien or Harold Cooper. As Johnson hurried off, Sarah's phone rang. It was the lab with results from the latest crime scene. Chief, the technician's voice was excited. We found partial prints on the note left with Father O'Brien. They're not in any database, but they match partials found at the other scenes. Sarah's pulse quickened. It wasn't much, but it was their first real lead. Thanks. Send over everything you've got. Just as she hung up, Johnson burst back into the office, his face pale. Chief, you need to see this. He laid out a series of old photographs on her desk. They showed a group of men standing in front of the old church, including younger versions of Tom Fletcher's father and Ellen Prescott's grandfather. But it was the figure in the center that caught Sarah's attention. A man wearing a priest's collar who looked remarkably like a younger Father O'Brien. "There's more," Johnson said, his voice shaking slightly. "I found an old police report. Harold Cooper was questioned after the fire. He claimed he saw someone leaving the scene, but he later recanted his statement." Sarah's mind raced, trying to connect the dots. The killer is targeting people connected to the church fire. But why now, after all these years? Before Johnson could respond, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The truth will set you free. But first it will shatter everything you thought you knew. 4 of 7. Sarah's blood ran cold. "Johnson, get a trace on this number now. And put out an APB on Harold Cooper. We need to find him before it's too late." As they rushed out of the office, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The killer was always one step ahead, and the body count was rising. She had to unravel the mystery of the church fire before more innocent lives were lost. Chapter 9: Buried Secrets. The search for Harold Cooper turned Millbrook upside down. Every abandoned building, every patch of woods was combed for any sign of the missing man. But as the hours ticked by, hope began to fade. Sarah stood in the old cemetery behind the ruins of the burned church, staring at the headstones of those who had died in the fire. 5 names, 5 lives cut short. But something didn't add up. "Johnson," she called to her deputy, "how many victims were there in the church fire?" He flipped through his notes. "According to the official report, 5. "Why?" Sarah pointed to a small, weathered headstone partially hidden by overgrown grass. "Then who's this?" They cleared away the vegetation to reveal a 6th grave, the name almost worn away by time. "James Holloway, beloved son, 1940 to 1953. "I don't understand," Johnson said. "Why isn't he listed in the official records?" Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang. It was the lab again. "Chief," the technician's voice was urgent, "we got a hit on those partial prints. They belong to a James Holloway, reported missing in 1953 but never found." Sarah's mind reeled. "That's impossible. He'd be in his 70s now." "There's more," the technician continued. "We ran a familial DNA match. James Holloway was Harold Cooper's cousin." The pieces started to fall into place in Sarah's mind. A covered-up death, a witness silenced, and a killer out for revenge decades later. "Johnson," she barked, "I need everything you can find on James Holloway and his connection to the other victims. And get me the addresses of any living relatives of the church fire victims. The killer's not done yet." As they raced back to the station, Sarah's phone buzzed with another text. "The dead don't always stay buried. Sometimes they come back to settle old scores. 5 of 7. Chapter 10: The Unraveling. Sarah's grip tightened on her phone as she read the latest message. The killer was taunting them, always one step ahead. But now, with the revelation about James Holloway, she felt they were finally closing in. Back at the station, Sarah and Johnson pored over the information they'd gathered. The connections between the victims and the church fire were becoming clearer, but the motive still eluded them. "Okay, let's break this down," Sarah said, writing on the whiteboard. Tom Fletcher's father was a firefighter at the scene. Ellen Prescott's grandfather was on the church board. Father O'Brien was a young priest at the time. And Harold Cooper was a witness who recanted his statement. Johnson nodded, following along. And James Holloway, Cooper's cousin, died in the fire but wasn't officially recorded as a victim. But why cover it up? Sarah tapped her marker against the board, thinking, there has to be more to it. What if James wasn't supposed to be in the church that night? What if he saw something he shouldn't have? Suddenly, Johnson's computer pinged with an alert. "Chief, we've got a hit on one of the addresses we were checking. Margaret Holloway, James's sister. She's still alive, living in a nursing home just outside of town." Sarah grabbed her jacket. "Let's go. She might be our last chance to understand what really happened that night." As they drove to the nursing home, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time. The killer had already struck 5 times. How many more would die before they could stop this? Chapter 11. The Missing Piece. Margaret Holloway sat in her wheelchair, her eyes clouded with cataracts but still sharp with intelligence. As Sarah introduced herself, she noticed the old woman's hands trembling slightly. "Mrs. Holloway," Sarah began gently, "we're here to ask you about your brother James and the church fire in 1953. Margaret's face tightened. "I've spent decades trying to forget that night. Why are you dredging it up now?" Sarah leaned forward. "Because someone is killing people connected to that fire. We believe it's related to what happened to your brother." For a long moment Margaret was silent. Then with a shaky sigh, she began to speak. "James wasn't supposed to be in the church that night. He'd snuck out to meet a girl. But when he got there he saw something terrible." "What did he see, Mrs. Holloway?" Sarah pressed. "A group of men, including some of the town's most respected citizens. They were performing some kind of ritual. James said it looked like they were sacrificing an animal. He tried to run, but they caught him." Sarah and Johnson exchanged shocked glances. This was far beyond what they had imagined. Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "They decided to silence him. Set the fire to cover it up. But it got out of control. More people died than they intended." "And the men responsible?" Sarah asked. "Some died in the fire themselves. The others swore a pact of silence. They buried James in secret and threatened our family to keep quiet." As they left the nursing home, Sarah's mind was reeling. A secret cult, a covered-up murder, and now a killer seeking vengeance for long-buried crimes. Her phone buzzed with another text. "The sins of the fathers have come due. Justice delayed is justice denied. 6 of 7. Sarah's heart raced. They were running out of time. The final victim was out there somewhere, and she had a sinking feeling she knew who it might be. Chapter 12. The Final Reckoning. Sarah and Johnson raced back to Millbrook, sirens blaring. As they approached the town limits, Sarah's phone rang. It was Mayor Simmons. "Chief Hawkins," his voice was panicked. "There's someone in my house. They left a note. Oh God, it says I'm next." "Mayor, listen to me," Sarah said urgently. "Lock yourself in a room and don't come out until we get there. We're on our way." As they sped towards the mayor's house, Sarah filled Johnson in on her theory. Simmons' father was the town mayor back in '53. If he was involved in the cover-up. Johnson nodded grimly. "The perfect final target for our killer." They screeched to a halt outside the mayor's sprawling home. The front door was ajar. Sarah drew her weapon, motioning for Johnson to cover her as they entered. The house was eerily quiet. They moved from room to room, finding nothing until they reached the study. Mayor Simmons was there, tied to a chair, his eyes wide with terror. And behind him, holding a gun, was a face Sarah recognized from old photographs: Harold Cooper. "Harold," Sarah said calmly, her weapon trained on him, "put the gun down. It's over." Harold's eyes were wild, filled with decades of pain and anger. "No, it's not over. Not until justice is served. Do you know what they did? What they covered up?" Sarah took a step forward. "I know about James, Harold. About the ritual, the fire. But this isn't the way to make it right. They killed my cousin," Harold shouted. "They let others die to protect their secret. And for years I couldn't say anything. But now they'll pay." Sarah could see Harold's finger tightening on the trigger. She had seconds to act. "Harold, think about James. Would he want this? More death, more cover-ups? Help us expose the truth. That's how we honor James's memory." For a moment, the room was silent save for the mayor's muffled whimpers. Then slowly Harold lowered the gun. As Johnson moved to handcuff him, Harold looked at Sarah with tears in his eyes. "I just wanted the truth to come out. After all these years." Sarah nodded solemnly. "And it will. I promise you we'll make sure of it." Epilogue. In the weeks that followed, Millbrook was turned upside down. The truth about the church fire and the secret cult came to light. Old wounds were reopened, long-buried secrets exposed. Some of the town's most prominent citizens were implicated, their legacies forever tarnished. Sarah stood at the newly erected memorial for the victims of the fire, including James Holloway. The town was still reeling, still coming to terms with its dark past. But there was also a sense of catharsis, of a weight finally lifted. As she placed a flower at the base of the memorial, Sarah's phone buzzed one last time. The message read, "The truth has been told. The cycle is complete. 7 of 7. Sarah deleted the message, knowing it was the last she'd receive. The case was closed, but its effects would ripple through Millbrook for years to come. As she walked back to her cruiser, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what other secrets lay buried in the quiet streets of small towns across America, waiting for their moment to come to light. The end.
Subscribe for more.